Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. I'm Jaclyn Phillips, and today's episode is what are the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission's plans for enforcement, breaking it down from A to CCC. Enforcement agencies around the globe have expressed increased appetite for upping the ante on antitrust enforcement and deploying new or refreshed methods, tools, and legal interpretations to accomplish their goals. The ACCC, led by Chair Gina Cass-Gottlieb, is no different, with issues like merger reform, cost of living pressures, and significant penalties from competition and consumer enforcement matters top of mind for the agency. The ACCC released enforcement priorities for 2024, putting out a benchmark against which the agency's successes can be measured and creating a window into what's to come. Today, we're going to hear not just about what those priorities are, but how they fit into the broader goals of the ACCC and fit into trends we're seeing in enforcement globally. I'm here with my co-host, Anant Raut, who's also the host of our sister podcast, Trust and Trade. Hey, Anant.
Hey, hi, Jaclyn.
Please introduce us to today's guest.
Peta Stevenson is a partner in the dispute resolution team at King & Wood Mallesons in Sydney, Australia. Peta has 25 years of experience navigating competition and consumer issues in Australia, and she specializes in competition litigation. So I think she's going to have great perspective on what we're here to talk about. Welcome, Peta.
Thanks, Anant. And it's great to be joining you from Bidjigal land, part of the Eora Nation. And I take this opportunity to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of those peoples.
Peta, for our listeners who aren't as familiar with the Australian regime, can you provide us some context? What is the ACCC? How is it structured? What is its scope of authority? How long has it been around? A little table setting before we get to our main course, if you will.
Yeah, not a problem, Anant. Well, the ACCC is one of Australia's key economic regulators. It was established back in 1974 as the Trade Practices Commission, although its roots go back to legislation that was introduced in 1906. And we're currently only up to the 7th chair of the ACCC, which, as you mentioned in the intro, is Gina Cass-Gottlieb. And while the ACCC has traditionally been headed by an economist, Gina is the first female chair and the first time that it's been a lawyer. It currently has 7 full-time commissioners, including the chair, and it also has associate commissioners, associate members. And at the moment, that includes a commissioner of the New Zealand Commerce Commission, which is really intended to promote alignment of competition law administration across the Tasman. And decisions are made by the Commission through a number of committees that are comprised of subgroups of commissioners, and they include committees like the Enforcement Committee, Compliance and Product Safety, and the Mergers Review Committee. Now, the ACCC is an independent statutory authority that's set up under Australia's Competition and Consumer Act, but there are 2 ways that the federal government can influence the ACCC's agenda. The first is through the Statement of Expectations that the government issues every year, and that sets out how it expects the ACCC to achieve its objectives, carry out its functions, and exercise its power, taking into account the government's policy priorities. And like everywhere at the moment, this year's a big focus of addressing cost of living issues. The second way the government can influence the ACCC's activities is through a statutory power that they have to direct the ACCC to undertake an inquiry. And the purpose of these market inquiries really is so that the ACCC can better understand the market and investigate patterns of conduct that may be anti-competitive. And those inquiries can be really short and sharp if there's a particular issue that's identified. So recently, coming out of COVID, there was an inquiry into childcare, and there's currently an inquiry into competition in supermarkets. But they also can be really long-running inquiries. We've got the Digital Platform Inquiry and Digital Platform Services Inquiry, which have been going since 2015. Electricity monitoring's been going since 2018. Gas since 2017, and they've still got another 5 years to go, and then regional mobile telco infrastructure as well. And that really enables the ACCC to gather evidence and data across a really long time period. Each one of those inquiries has an inquiry board that's led by one or more commissioners who oversee the framing and investigatory actions of the teams.
So our episode today is on the ACCC's 2024-2025 enforcement priority. What is this document, and how does this impact practitioner of Australian law.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anant. So the ACCC releases these enforcement priorities every year, and the purpose is to provide transparency and guidance both to businesses but also to consumers regarding the areas that it'll be focusing on for its enforcement activity. And broadly speaking, it's trying to do four things every time it releases this document. First, obviously, it's trying to enhance compliance, and by identifying specific areas of concern, it's helping businesses to understand where they need to particularly focus their efforts to avoid enforcement action. Second, it's allocating its resources in a way that it thinks is most effective and signalling that. So the ACCC, like every statutory agency, has limited resources, and by really clearly defining what its enforcement priorities are, it can then allocate resources effectively within the organisation to those issues that are most pressing. I say its resources are limited, but it did get a significant uplift in the last federal budget in May. It got a 10% uplift in its funding and a 10% uplift in staffing, which was more, for example, than the securities regulator got by quite a significant margin. It is. The third thing the ACCC does through its priorities every year is seeking to deter illegal conduct. So by publicly announcing what its enforcement priorities are, it's sending that signal to business and individuals about its commitment to enforcing the law in those areas. And this is intended to act as a deterrent to illegal conduct because people are hopefully more cautious about engaging practices that are under particular ACCC scrutiny. It also gives a signal to others in the market that this is something the ACCC is interested in, and if they have witnessed something untoward, that they can take that forward as a whistleblower to the ACCC. And then finally, the fourth thing that the enforcement priorities does is provides an opportunity for the ACCC to engage with its stakeholders. It always consults with business, consumer groups, and other parts of government in relation to the priorities so it can better understand the challenges and concerns that are facing businesses and consumers, which really does that dialogue, which happens right before the release and after, really does help inform what the ACCC's priorities are. And they undertake various surveys throughout the year to help them understand what the market's reaction is. Now, this document, it's been released by the ACCC every year since 2011. And it really does cover the broad gamut of the work that the ACCC does across competition and antitrust, consumer protection, product safety, and also access to monopoly infrastructure. And so it really is a great statement of how broad the ACCC's activities are.
Chair Cass Gottlieb, you've been in the role for about 2 years now. Is that right?
That's right.
She took over for Raut Sims at the end of 2022. So she's something of a track record for us to measure her again. How would you say panned out relative to her tenure, relative to her goals and expectations for her going in?
Yeah, so Gina Cass Gottlieb took over from the ACCC after Rod Sims had announced the priorities for that year, but shortly after she took over the role, she did affirm those as the continuing goals of the Commission. And I've got to say, Anant, in the last 12 months, we've seen some really big results for the ACCC, including more than $620 million in penalties. That's about $411 million in local change in America. And that includes some of the highest penalties that we've seen to date, both on the consumer protection side and on the competition side. So there was a penalty that was imposed against Blue Scope Steel for bid rigging of $57.5 million, and the Phoenix Institute for unconscionable conduct, and that was $438 million, the highest consumer protection penalty that's been imposed in Australia. We've also had the second highest fine for criminal cartel conduct following on pretty quickly. That was in the waste disposal industry. And there's some really significant litigation that the Cass Gottlieb Commission has commenced against the national carrier Qantas here. It is, however, a little early to tell what the impact of the chair has had in terms of enforcement outcomes, because it does take time for matters to be investigated, and the ACCC has to take matters to court to be able to obtain any penalties. They do have the ability to issue infringement notices, which are often referred to as speeding fines. They're much lower amounts, but for a matter to work its way through the court can take a number of years. That said, though, Anant, we've really seen a laser focus from the ACCC since the chair took the role in relation to the cases that they're bringing. So it's not the results so much, but where we're seeing them focus their attention and bring cases. And we're seeing them really focus on cases that have broad-ranging impacts in industries and markets that will deliver results for consumers in those markets and also significant deterrence. And because of the reputation that Gina Cass-Gottlieb has, her experience, she's a really strategic media operator, and business people and directors in particular are really listening carefully to the language that she's using and obviously observing really intently where she's actually taking action. She's a very thoughtful communicator. Her appointment to the ACCC was a real coup for the government. But I did want to point out that in the recent years, there've been a number of really significant appointments at the Commission, and that includes Commissioner Liza Carver, who chairs the ACCC's Enforcement Committee. She's also an incredibly respected competition practitioner coming in from private practice, who also had experience with being part of the energy regulator, and she was also an associate commissioner at the ACCC as part of her experience. And they've made some really significant hires of senior personnel, both in the legal and the investigatory sides of the ACCC, that have great commercial experience that they're bringing into the ACCC. And that movement between government and private practice has typically occurred much more in the US than we've seen in Australia. So maybe these appointments are a sign that that's starting to change here.
Thanks, Peta. And that's a good overview of, I think, how the ACCC is functioning right now and who's in there running it and how that might impact what we're going to talk about now, which is the new priorities. So you said, the priorities were already in place when Chair Cass-Gottlieb took that role. And it seems now that there have been some significant changes. So I want to start, looking at that enforcement priorities document with the new sectors. So what are the new sectors that the Commission's focused on, and why are their concerns placed there?
Yeah, so every year when the ACCC releases its enforcement priorities, it has what it calls strategic priorities and then enduring priorities. And the focus generally goes straight to the specific priorities, given that they're going to be the matters that have new attention on them. And this year we saw 3 new additions to the specific priorities, and they were supermarkets, aviation, and consumer law compliance by NDIS providers, which I'll explain a bit about. But I don't think that of those 3, any of them were much of a surprise to those of us here in Australia. Supermarkets are obviously at the centre of the cost of living debate here in Australia. The aviation sector is a focus, as part of a post-COVID recovery. And travellers have been suffering a lot of cancellations and delays. That's been a very publicly debated issue. And then the third, which relates to the NDIS, that's Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is actually quite an amazing world-first insurance scheme to ensure that Australians can be in charge of the packages of services that they receive if they have a disability. It's placing a lot more autonomy in people's hands. But it has been the subject of significant consumer complaint by users of the system. And so this priority is really intended to ensure that providers are acting with honesty and transparency and integrity, both in relation to the pricing of products and services to the participants in the insurance scheme, but also in the way that those services are described.
And just as kind of further background for those of us not familiar with this, how does the distinction between enduring priorities and these strategic or specific priorities work with respect to resources that the Commission is putting towards these or types of cases they might be opening? Yeah,
that's a great question, Jaclyn. So the ACCC has a pretty well-established structure that's headed by general managers in different divisions. And then it stands up project teams to deal with particular things. And that might be one of the market studies. So, for example, there's a supermarkets board of inquiry that's been established because, as well as this being a priority of the ACCC, they've now been directed by government to hold an inquiry into competition in the supermarket sector. So there's a whole new team that stood up to deal with that. And similarly in relation to aviation. What the enduring priorities reflect is the fact that there is some types of conduct that are of consistent concern, and it's not always measured by whether it is particularly prevalent in the community at a particular time. So like the number one enduring priority is always cartel conduct because of the deleterious effect that it has on markets and consumers and also, other businesses. And so they are permanently staffed kind of in standing teams, whether it's in the cartel enforcement group or for scams, for example, through the digital platforms unit. There's people that are dedicated to those activities all the time, rather than for the specific priorities. They're cross-function expertise groups that are brought together, and they often draw in expertise from outside the ACCC to deal with the specific priorities, whether that's industry expertise or a particular type of expert that they need to have on board so that they can fully understand that market.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And maybe that partly answers some of the next question, which is that the report removed some specific priorities, including competition issues for digital platforms, which I think when you read it, you're like, they can't possibly think that's not an issue anymore. So how does the removal of certain priorities fit into the bigger picture? Does it mean that they're now enduring priorities? Does it mean, they're done looking into those things?
Yeah, and so you're exactly right. There were 5 that came out, and 2 of them have been added to the list of enduring priorities, so scams and a focus on small business. So they are now in the list of enduring priorities. But some of the matters that were specific priorities already fell within the scope of a broader enduring priority. So digital, for example, is something that remains an enduring priority and has just had, a bit of a glow up in terms of the way that it's described there, a bit more particularity around it. So when you look at the enduring priority for digital commerce, it includes, online reviews, influencers, online advertising. There's a whole bucket of activity. And I think what that really just reflects is a recognition by the Commission and by government that, this is the environment in which we're going to continue to operate. And so that's what switched it into being a broader enduring priority.
I also found the removal of competition issue interesting. Another topic that I didn't see in the priorities was AI, which is, this topic du jour that a lot of people in the bar are focused on. And instead, what I saw was this focus on consumer pocketbook issues, supermarket, air travel. Has there been a shift, or as you said, is it just a shifting between specific priorities and enduring priorities on these issues?
I really do see it as that shift more to enduring. Anant, that said, the Digital Platform Services Inquiry that the ACCC has been running since 2017, they do really in-depth reports every 6 months on particular areas, including digital advertising, search, a whole range of different topic areas. They've got one to go. Their last report, their 10th report. They haven't announced what that topic is yet, but everyone's wondering whether it's going to be AI. That said, the commissioners have been out talking about the impacts of AI and how important it is for people in a digital context to be really observant about what content is being delivered to them now in the context particularly of social influencers and scams that are happening online. So it does form part of that enduring digital priority, but we're all waiting to see what that 10th report is going to be about.
So as we were talking about AI, things that are topics really around the globe, you mentioned earlier deterrence, right? That's one that will sound really familiar to U.S. practitioners. We hear our enforcement agencies talking about actions they're taking and the effect of, challenging a lot of deals and whether that then deters companies from entering into, transactions. Are there any priorities or emphases that the Commission has that you think are either, parallel with things that we're seeing in enforcement around the globe or drawing influence from other agencies?
I think, we're a small island nation down the bottom end of the globe, Jaclyn, and we like to think that rather than being influenced by other jurisdictions, it's an exchange of ideas. That said, obviously there's a major debate in Australia at the moment about merger reform, and the government has committed to changing that regime. And that is in part to make it more consistent with the approach that's taken in the US and the UK, Europe, many other countries. We were one of the last voluntary jurisdictions left for merger filings. We are obviously encountering a lot of the same issues, societal issues and economic issues that are being dealt with overseas. There are some ways that we do feel, we have led. So Rod Sims, as you mentioned, Anant, the previous ACCC chair, launched the first digital platforms inquiry in 2015 and was very fond of reminding people that was a world first. As we've talked about, consumer and fair trading issues in the digital economy are a priority everywhere. One thing that I think does stand out, though, about the ACCC, and specifically Gina Cascott-Lieb as the chair, has been the continued emphasis on the equal balancing by the ACCC of consumer and competition issues. They're really given equal priority. And the ACCC has long done that, had that significant focus on consumer protection. And that they're obviously a very different type of case to investigate and prosecute, and that's reflected in the number of cases that they actually bring. So in the last 5 years, the ACCC has brought 45 new consumer protection cases and 14 new competition actions. So I think that's really important to note, that dual focus. It's been really interesting for us to see, for example, late in 2022, the Federal Trade Commission's policy statement about Section 5 of the FTC Act and methods of unfair competition. So I do think there is this really deep exchange of ideas that does happen between the key regulators, and Australia is really pleased to be part of that.
Jaclyn, I want to go in the opposite direction and touch on some priorities that are particular to Australia. Peta, can you tell us what the priorities document tells us about the ACCC's focus on conduct impacting First Nations Australians? Maybe starting with educating us on what the term First Nations Australians means.
Yeah, so First Nations Australians is a term that's used to describe the original inhabitants of Australia. We have one of the longest continuous cultures in the world, and there are reminders, every corner that you turn around, how strong the connection to land, water, community, culture is in Australia. And this enduring priority really does reflect by the ACCC the fact that there can be particularly severe effects of conduct on First Nations people, which, much to the shame of Australia, really, are affected by really much lower socioeconomic indicators in a lot of different areas than the average Australian. And one of the particular disadvantages is that in many of the communities where First Nations Australians live, they are much more distant from major centres, which means that there is much less choice and much less competition available. And so any conduct that takes place that is anti-competitive or unconscionable in those communities can have a really significant effect. And one of the recent examples of the way that the ACCC has sought to take action has been proceedings against one of the telecommunications providers for unconscionable conduct, going into markets to sell long-term mobile phone contracts to Indigenous consumers who would not have the means to pay those contracts over time, and who may not have had those contracts fully explained to them. So there was a penalty of $50 million that was imposed, which at the time was one of the most significant consumer law penalties that had been imposed anywhere. And the ACCC now has a dedicated First Nations coordination, outreach and advocacy team, and that's really helping to make sure that activities across the whole of the ACCC, all of the groups regarding conduct impacting First Nations Australians, is well organised and well informed, noting that, when we're going into remote First Nations communities, we need to be really culturally aware about the impact that we can have in our communications and our own actions.
This has been a great primer on enforcement in Australia. Peta, in your view, what are the key takeaways for companies on what the ACCC's priorities are?
Well, it's actually really great timing to be speaking with you, Anant and Jaclyn, because this year marks 50 years since the Competition and Consumer Act has been in force. And when the legislation was first introduced into Parliament, the Attorney-General described it as providing a national basis for protection for consumers against unfair practices that cause prices to be maintained at artificially high levels, enable groups of enterprises to attain positions of economic dominance that are subject to abuse, and interfere with the interplay of competitive forces, allowing discriminatory action against small business and the exploitation of consumers, and what he called the feather bedding of particular industries. I think that it's really important that businesses recognise that the ACCC is a well-resourced, intelligent and agile enforcer of the law, and it's really focusing on those key challenges that the economy is facing and that are of concern for consumers. And for those that might be starting operation in Australia, they need to know that the ACCC is not afraid to test the limits of the law, and that includes in relation to digital contexts. And there are a number of proceedings that they've taken in the last 5 years against digital platforms, which not just are testing the substance of the law, but are also seeking to test the extent of the extraterritorial application of the law. And so any company doing business in Australia should be mindful of that, and also mindful of that dual enforcement, both in the consumer protection and competition sides, because the ACCC is a well-oiled machine that communicates very well between its different teams because of the way that commissioners operate on those different committees by which they make decisions. So there is a lot of exchange of information, and something that might come in as a complaint by a consumer about the way they've been treated in a store could end up as a cartel matter.
Well, thank you so much, Peta. Like Anant said, this has been just a great discussion about everything from how the ACCC works to what they focus on in the past, what they focus on in the future, and a lot of specifics about Australia that are just, we wouldn't know without this talk. So thank you. But before we let you go, we want to learn a little bit more about you. So tell us something about yourself that we may not know just from working with you.
I love swimming in ocean pools. The coast of New South Wales, which is the state where I live on the east coast of Australia, has more than 100 ocean pools, and they're a mix of natural formations, public baths that have been constructed, and in some places they were built as the result of convict labour. So when we're on a family weekend away, we're always trying to tick off as many ocean pools as we can. And even at this time of year, so we're in winter here in the southern hemisphere, and the ocean temperatures drop quite a bit, but we'll still have a dip.
That's awesome. I went to Sydney on my honeymoon and saw them, but I did not swim in one. So now I will just have to find a reason to
We will
come back.
welcome you with open arms, Jaclyn.
And now for our last segment, The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
All right. So pick a number from 1 to 19. It's very random.
I've got triplets, so it'll have to be 3.
Oh, another fun fact. We got 2 and 1. Is there any popular food item that you dislike?
There is every country has its own snacks, right? And in Australia, there's a war between 2 corn-based cheese products, if I can describe them that way. So there's the war of the twisty, which are long and thin, and then there are cheesels, which are round, with kind of like burger rings, but they're cheesy. I am a great lover of cheesels, but I will not eat a twisty.
Yet another reason I have to come back to Australia so I could help you settle this debate about which corn-based cheese snack is better.
Definitely requires ACCC investigation, I think.
If we're doing 2 for 1 for personal information, I have a second question I would like to ask Peta, because this is just recently blown up on my law school group chat, and I need to ask an actual Australian. Are world maps in Australia what we would consider upside down, in that they have the South Pole on top and Australia in the top left corner?
No, our globes are still just the same as yours. It's all good.
All right, Peta. Well, thank you so much. This was great.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.